meeting of the Sioux Falls City Council. I'd like to call the meeting to order. It is December 6th, 2016. Welcome everyone again in the audience and also how the microphones are. So, how are we doing down there? Okay, I'll speak louder until that happens. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Again, it's the 6th of December, and this is Sioux Falls Informational Meeting. Thank you all for being here, and all those who are watching at home. I'm going to start with a little something. With the events that have happened this week, our thoughts and prayers are with the Ethan McMahon family during this very difficult time in their lives. Mr. McMahon was a father of 2 sons and a veteran who served in Afghanistan. I also want to express our sincere gratitude to those first responders, including the firefighters, the police, paramedics, volunteers, and others who tirelessly worked amongst the wreckage, risking their own lives for a time for the sake of others. Let's not forget the families of our first responders and all others impacted by the tragedy. I would ask you to please join me in a moment of silence and respect for Ethan and everyone. Thank you all very much. I would like to ask Regan Smith to come up and give us a little update on what's happening with the building situation.
Okay, thanks for having me. Regan Smith, Emergency Management, City of Sioux Falls. I think I'll just give a really short synopsis of what happened last Friday, December 2nd, and what we've been through and kind of where we see this incident moving forward. Last Friday, December 2nd, at 10:28 a.m., a call came in to 911 announcing there was a significant structure collapse downtown. An intense response began immediately. At 1:28 p.m., a 22-year-old woman was rescued alive and well, and then at 5:38 p.m., the body of a 24-year-old deceased male was recovered. The city maintained control of the site through the weekend and rescued 3 dogs. Police did leave the scene this morning, finally. The site is contained and under control of the property owner and their contractor. Our main role in this incident continues to be public safety. Because of the remaining structure is a hazard to the public, we remain involved ensuring that those structures are stabilized or demolished safely. The structures are vulnerable to weather conditions, vibrations from vehicles that could cause additional collapse. Just want to remind the council or inform the council and the public that street closures remain in place until the remaining at-risk structure can be safely removed. We have opened some of the stretches over the last day. Phillips Avenue is now open between 10th and 11th Street. 10th Street is now open between Phillips Avenue and Main. 10th Street remains closed from Mall Avenue to Phillips Avenue. Phillips Avenue remains closed between 9th and 10th Street. If traveling through downtown, we urge the public to please use 8th and 14th Streets. The First Avenue ramp is accessible by 10th Street, and Sioux area Metro buses are up and running from the downtown depot. We just ask the public, the downtown Sioux Falls businesses and workers to please be patient as we work through this. We'd just like to acknowledge some of the agencies that were involved. Sioux Falls Fire Rescue, City Emergency Management, Sioux Falls Police, Animal Control, the Public Works team of Street, Light and Power, Engineering, Landfill, Environmental, Water and Water Rec. Sioux Area Metro provided buses to warm responders. Minnehaha County Emergency Management, the Police Reserve, Minnehaha County Search and Rescue, Minnehaha County Sheriff's Office, South Dakota Highway Patrol, Rapid City Fire, Watertown Fire, and Aberdeen Fire are all our partners on the South Dakota Task Force. The South Dakota Air Guard Fire Department, Metro Communications, Red Cross, Avera transported the search dog for us, downtown Sioux Falls. Henry Carlson provided equipment and staff. Grant Howman from Washington Square Group, Mid-American Gas, and again, numerous individuals and businesses. I'm sure I forgot somebody. We're still compiling all this, but we couldn't have done any of this without those folks and many, many more. Some of our initial takeaways at this point, looking at it, is the incident command system worked well. The unified command was formed very early between police, fire, and the public works departments. The state radio digital system worked well. It did not fail, and that was a great thing for us to have in place. Public information was a big task during this incident. We held many briefings, social media. We had high local and national interest in this. And then finally, the urban search and rescue team performed at a high level with their state partners. Moving forward, again, safety of the general public is going to be continue to be our #1 priority. We're going to communicate with the public and downtown Sioux Falls business on the traffic plans, but they will be very fluid, and we'll continue to update folks on that. We're going to document the incident, the number of personnel, equipment, agencies, begin critical incident stress management sessions for our responders and workers, and then down the line have an after-action meeting where we'll identify any shortfalls and then develop an improvement plan with the needed training plans and equipment. With that's where we're at, Council, and if you have any questions, I can attempt to ask them.
Are there any questions of the council? Councilor Staley?
I just needed to say, watching TV that day, I was so impressed with our fire chief, Jim Sedaris, with Lieutenant Lauren McManus, and with you, Reagan. Your upfrontness and openness with the public was so wonderful, so reassuring. I know it was a horrible day for you, but I think the community really appreciated everything that you did. So thank you.
I would echo those thoughts very much, as I did earlier. Okay, thank you very much, Regan, and keep up the good work. Council open discussion.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I have a brief announcement that I wanted to share with everyone. There's an event coming up this weekend, and I was given a little something to read, and then if you don't mind, I might want to expand just a minute or two on it. But Compassionate Sioux Falls is hosting a living library this weekend from 2 to 4 on Sunday, December 11th at the Ronning Library on 49th Street. The event is free and open to the public. The goal of Compassionate Sioux Falls is to move people from tolerance to acceptance. One of the ways that we do this is through the Living Library. Everyone has a story, and this is an opportunity to ask questions that you've always wanted to ask, but were too afraid to in a safe setting. There will be 18 books available for checkout, with stories being a domestic violence survivor, surviving being gay in a Midwest town, being in a wheelchair, being gay in school, genderqueer atheist, liberal feminist, trans activist, transgendered woman, a woman who grew up in the 50s and 60s recovering from drug addiction, a hippie, felon, and then a transgendered woman growing up transgendered in rural America, a individual who is Muslim, also another person who is a former member of a hate group, and a survivor of sexual abuse, and being adopted biracial. I was privileged a couple of months ago to attend a Compassionate Sioux Falls Living Library event. My family was so moved by it that my son asked immediately afterwards if he could participate, and he will be participating as one of the books, and a chance to share his story of being biracial and adopted. For us and our family, adoption has been a big part of our family. Both of our children are adopted. So I encourage people to come out on Sunday afternoon, December 11th from 2 to 4 at the Ronning Library.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Staley?
And I wanted to give a thumbs up to our council member here, Councilor Pat Starr. He was competed in the International Chef Cook-Off for the Multicultural Center on Saturday. I was able to go. And he won't tell us this, but he spent his own money to provide the food for this. So I was very proud of him, and I think he really represented our council well. So thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Did you
I am
win?
willing to pass the torch, though, for next year on the council. I took one for the team this year, but I'm willing to allow each of you to participate,
We
or
wanna
maybe
know
a team effort.
if you won or not.
I did
was
not
there a
win.
winner?
I
Oh.
did not win, but the football coach from Roosevelt High School won, and it was a great event, and it was great to learn about things at the Multicultural Center and serve a great purpose in our community.
And then I'm sure it was good, though, whatever you cooked in the most.
I had a 5-cheese fondue fountain,
That's
so
right.
it was good.
We're going to have you catering dinner sometime here. Thank you very much. Any other open discussion? Oh, Councilor Erikson.
Thank you. I just wanted to update the council. Last week, Councilors Staley, Rolfing, and Selberg, along with our staff and lobbyist Yvonne Taylor, met with several area legislators that encompass Sioux Falls in one way, shape, or form. We discussed our legislative priorities, the draft, which you'll be hearing about more later. The conversation was great. We talked about many other issues facing Sioux Falls and the state as a whole, one being the state radio system, and talked about that in great detail. And again, it's just a great time to build the relationships with the other legislators as they go on to peer and had the budget address today. Right. So just if you have questions, happy to answer those, but just a great time to talk about this issues coming up this legislative session.
Yes, it was. Councilor Arpenbach.
I just wanted to bounce off of that. If you talked about state radio, because Regan Smith just talked about, and I quote, "State radio did not fail. Thank goodness." My parenthetical, thank goodness. I mean, we're at a point where that's going to be a big deal, and I was going to say it to Regan, but I didn't want to put the cloud on his wonderful report. But yes, it is something that the City Council is going to have to be very aware of. And as a member of the Metro Management Council and Councilor Kiley as well, something we're really going to have to pay attention to going into this legislative session. So I'm glad you talked about it with them.
It is, and myself and Commissioner Benega have been in conversations with the representative from Motorola, and some of the challenges that the current radio system has, not just for Sioux Falls, but the region and the impact. We've been able to update our system over time just with the parts, but we're almost to a break fail where you're having a radio and they're stopping manufacturing many of these pieces, and so you're taking an old radio, taking whatever button you need to fix the other ones to make sure that they're still working properly. And so there are a couple legislators, there are dead spots in South Dakota, not in Sioux Falls, but in South Dakota. And this is really a basic function of government, in my opinion, to have that public safety radio system. And so the representative from Motorola did come down to Sioux Falls. Myself and Commissioner Benega did meet with him, talked about the proposal potentially to the state, and hoping that we can get something with the help of our legislators in place, because it really is about the state as a whole, making sure we're not one disaster away from this radio system failing. They've also been meeting with Metro, with Paul Niederinghaus as well. The same day he met with us, he then went to a meeting and met with him. And so there's a lot of moving parts. I am in conversations also with Yvonne Taylor, as well as Senator Peters and David Anderson, talking about what next. How can we build a coalition to hopefully come in and make this a priority for the state this year? And how does it impact the cities and the communities statewide? It's a big issue, and in the future, we just need to make sure that this radio system is up to par and it's not one disaster away from failing.
No, that's right. It has to be something that's maintained on a consistent basis. Really what we ended up doing as the state of South Dakota is just buying a system and saying, yep, here you go, good enough. And now they're buying parts off of eBay, right. So it's kind of scary. So good, I'm glad you were talking about that. Thank you.
Thank you. And the support was there, and the legislators get it, especially the legislators that serve Sioux Falls, but also serve some of our more rural areas outside of Sioux Falls, because they realize a lot of times the help comes from Sioux Falls. And so we have a great management system here to be able to send fire, to be able to send different groups of people. And if we can't communicate, we can't get there and we can't help.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, no more open discussion. I would ask for our first presentation on PreTrial Task Force report. Aaron?
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you and the public about a project that we've been working on now for just over a year, almost a year and a half. And what I'm going to talk about today is some pre-trial work that the county and the city and the state and other stakeholders have been working on to bring some best practices to our community. Before I go any further, I just wanted to make sure we're all kind of talking the same language and talk about what pretrial is, what we mean when we say pretrial. And what pretrial is from the point of arrest until the point of your court hearing where you're found guilty or not guilty. And in between that time, your charges could be dismissed or let go if there wasn't enough evidence, or you could be diverted. But in general, we're talking about from the time you're arrested until the time you have your court date. About a year and a half ago, the state and the county and the city were talking about different ways and different, how can we make our system better? What can we do? And they worked with the national organization, the Crime and Justice Institute, to come and do an evaluation of our pretrial system. From that evaluation, they produced a report, and the report was about 5 or 6 recommendations for our jurisdiction to implement to better our pretrial system. What the commission did then was form an interagency collaborative. Actually, we formed 2 committees to carry out the recommendations of the report. After meeting a few times with a steering committee, it was decided that the first project we were going to take on is implementing an objective risk instrument. And after doing a little bit of research, the Arnold Foundation stood out amongst the various risk instruments that are out there. To be able to implement the Arnold Risk Instrument, which is the Public Safety Assessment, the PSA, you have to apply to the Arnold Foundation. They have to accept your application and then come do a site visit, evaluate you on your site visit, and then you have to sign an interagency MOU to agree to follow the model. So we did all that, got the MOU signed just last month. What the Public Safety Assessment is, it's an objective risk instrument to use for pretrial. It measures 2 main things, someone's propensity to commit a new violent crime or someone's propensity not to come to court. And the key is to give the judges a tool as they decide who to release before they're found guilty into the community. This PSA, it's been rigorously researched by top-tier researchers, lots of publications, over 1 million cases to demonstrate, improve, and validate the measures that they use. Everyone's top concern in this is to protect public safety, and that's moving to more of a risk-based versus a charge-based system. And again, they're very, very, very attuned to the methodology that they used, and so that MOU that we had to sign assured that we followed their model while we implement this tool. What you see here is the 9 factors that will be measured when implementing this risk instrument. Again, it's measuring a person's, if they're going to fail to appear in their court hearing, whether they're going to commit a new crime activity, and whether there's going to be a new violent crime activity. So basically there's 3 scores. Well, there's 2 scores and then a violence flag. Again, everybody's top priority is to protect public safety. And so what this tool does is kind of takes a person's history and their most current offense and puts it through this evaluation, and then provides the judge with a report for them to use in their decision-making at that initial appearance. So now that we've been approved to use it, we've had 1 site visit. The next step is to do a next site visit and start an implementation process. Implementation takes about 6 to 12 months. Part of being approved to work with the Arnold Foundation is we get technical assistance from national experts, and they will be coming back in January to provide a training and get us started on that process. Another exciting aspect is that Pennington County has also been approved to use this risk tool. They are involved in MacArthur grant. You can Google it and look it up. They've been involved in that process just over a year, and this is a part of their overall reform efforts in that county. So we'll be collaborating with them on certain aspects as appropriate as we move forward with the implementation of this tool. Something that we're going to have to work on is building a data infrastructure. We need to work on that as a state and locally to be able to have the data that we need to implement to the tool and to make sure we can evaluate what we're doing to make sure it's working. And the last thing is that community is key. Our stakeholder work groups that we have representatives from the state level. We have Greg Satizan from the State Court Administrator's Office. We have local judges. We have law enforcement. We have the Sheriff's Office. We have the jail. We have commissioners. We have city councilors. We have nonprofits. It's important that we work together as a community to evaluate it and come up with a solution in order for it to make it work. We're very, very excited to get going and look forward to starting this process. Any questions?
I just will just say thank you for being here. I am the counselor that is on this task force. It's been very interesting to walk through this process with all the different levels of individuals involved. It's been a huge collaborative process from having the police involved with the sheriff's office, with the judges, and it really is a prime example of us solving our problems locally, trying to wade through some of the issues as we're locking up those that that are dangerous to the community and not necessarily that we're mad at. And so this is a great tool. It's a huge accomplishment for the county to be able to get this, and it's exciting for all of those that are involved in this. So thank you for being here and presenting this. Lots of work still to do.
Yes.
Keep working on it. It's an important
Thank you.
new opportunity for us to handle these situations.
Right. Right. Thanks.
Okay. City administration update. Sue?
Good afternoon. Sue Quan Bucket, Director of Central Services, here to give you an update on the Sioux new City Administration Building project. Well, as you know, funding is secured and in the bank for the project. Our first bid package will be advertised later this week, and we have finalized our occupancy plan. So I'll go through that in a minute. It was important for us to finalize that to know who is going in which building so that we can finalize the interior design for the building. And one of our primary goals all along was to have some growth space in both the new building and in our city hall. Again, just to go through the goals that guided us throughout these last couple of years in this journey leading up to this point. We want to make a positive business impression. We want to combine our city staff to create efficiencies where possible. This is beneficial for the public as well as for our staff. We need to plan for growth. As you know, the city continues to grow year over year, and we don't see that stopping anytime soon. And we need to keep up with that growth. And then fourth, maximizing the taxpayer dollar, which has always been a primary goal. So this is what we're planning in terms of the new building. So the thought is, we're going to have a nice customer service information counter right in the lobby area of that new building. And we are going to have it serve as our business and development center. So this will be the place where people go, their contractors or their developers. They want to talk about their plans. They want to talk about permitting. They want to talk about inspections. They want to talk about the engineering plan. Hence, on the first floor of the new building, we plan to incorporate alcohol licensing, parks administration, planning, zoning, and building services. And on second floor, engineering, and public works administration. And again, just keeping those goals that I just went through in mind in terms of that collaboration aspect of the city staff, and to make it as easy as possible for the public to interact with us. And in our current city hall, our plan is this. On ground floor, we plan to move affordable housing into the ground floor area. And again, we've remodeled ground floor of City Hall recently, put in a nice customer service counter, and we want to utilize it to the greatest extent possible. Affordable housing, as you know, interacts with the public, with residents, for the loan programs that they have for affordable housing, for the rebate programs that they have for furnaces and other energy efficient programs like that. Fire prevention, we plan to relocate to ground floor. So these are the fire inspectors, fire marshal, and the assistant fire marshal. Public parking, as you know, they also interact with the public in terms of the leased spaces in our city ramps as well as our city surface lots. And again, to have that public facing counter down there where people can go in and take care of business quickly and efficiently, public parking will be there. And then the last one would be utility billing. So again, they have a lot of foot traffic in terms of people walking in and out. We want to make it as easy as possible for them to interact with our city staff. So those are the folks who are planning to relocate to ground floor of City Hall. As we've said all along, leasing was a good short-term solution, but not one that we wanted to continue in a long-term fashion. Hence, we will be discontinuing our lease of the 100 South Dakota Avenue building effective in 2018. We will be moving the legal team back to City Hall. So they will relocate to first floor. The mayor's office will stay where they are. We will move community development from the 100 South Dakota Avenue building back across the street to City Hall and have them relocate on second floor. Human resources, we have just built out their space for them with a remodel that we did, and they will stay where they are. And in third floor, finance. And finance is there now, but they don't really have growth space to speak of. So again, it's that objective that we want to meet to have growth space in both of our buildings. So the plan is to move fire prevention down to ground floor. Since they're in and out quite a bit, it'll be more convenient for them as well. And then finance would have some growth space up on third floor. And our next big milestone will be next month, where we're planning on groundbreaking. Considering the weather, especially today, I think we'll be using a backhoe instead of a shovel, but we will plan to break ground next month. And with that, that concludes my updates. We do plan to have quarterly updates to you going forward for the remainder of the project.
Question for Quan. Councilor Knight.
Director, I actually think this is a really neat way to split people up, make it kind of customer service centric. So it's something I hadn't thought of. I really like it. Have you looked at if there's going to be significant cost to do any remodeling or reshuffling in City Hall, or is it because it's so modular and already that you can kind of move things around? Do you know what kind of a budget would be for the City Hall portion?
The plan has been and will continue to be that where we have bought new furnishings in the last 2 to 4 years, engineering, for example, that we would move their new furnishings over to the new building. So that's been part of the project. We would do the same thing with planning, zoning, and building services, move their new furnishings over to the new building as well. We were always planning to buy new furnishings for utility billing, and that hasn't changed. It's just that they'll be in City Hall instead of the other building. I don't foresee any significant renovation costs. Like you said, we do have the open office concept in the works on second floor and ground floor, and that's mainly where we'll be relocating people.
Okay, and I think it's great, kind of the thought of how you could reuse that customer service counter downstairs. It sounds like all these customer-facing people, the water billing, and they can just kind of walk in that bottom door, get their thing done, and out the door they go.
Exactly right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We point out that there's parking at the door for that situation.
That's exactly right. There's nice diagonal parking right there in the alley that will be well utilized. And we will have 40 new spaces over in front of the new building that will also be well utilized.
Other questions?
I do.
Oh, Councilor Erikson?
I just have a couple questions as far as the space that's room for growth or the empty space. Are there any plans as far as just for that space, or is it just kind of wait and see if we need to move people around? Obviously, with moving parking out of the basement here, if there's a plan for that, or and then twofold with that, any plans with the buildings other than the 2018 plan of not leasing that building anymore? Any other plans with the other buildings that we have as far as like utility building or any of that, just as we move forward? It may be too early to know until we get going. I understand that, but just curious.
Yeah. In terms of utility building and the Parks Admin building, we do not have any definite plans for those yet. We're going to have a little bit of time here, 12 to 15 months or so to finalize that, but we will take a hard look at that and decide what is the best use of those buildings. In terms of vacated space, we plan to utilize them for conference rooms, meeting rooms, wherever possible. And in terms of the Carnegie down here, I've already had requests from some, or the thought has passed by in terms of the internal audit folks maybe relocating to a little bit nicer, higher quality workspace.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate your report.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Director. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is Tracy Turback, Director Turback with the Pension Revision Trust. We're looking forward to your presentation and clearing up all the misinformation that has been portrayed throughout the press, for instance, about this movement of some funds.
Thank you, Councilor Rolfing and all the councilors. I appreciate the time today. I certainly won't dwell on that, but we're certainly eager to be here as well and provide as much information as we can to you folks and to the public and our employees and retirees about some of these changes that are being proposed. Started this discussion a couple of weeks ago, or I did, with you folks at a very high level, and as I mentioned then, this is really the final step to be taken that really emanated from the 2013 pension reforms that were adopted by the council back then. So as promised, today we're here with a full presentation. With me today also have the team that's been working on this project for some time. Bill O'Toole, our HR director, our city attorney David Fifley, and along with those folks, Angie Youthy from HR and Tom Huber from our finance department have been really doing a lot of the heavy lifting on the project. In addition, joining me in the presentation today will be Mary Beth Breitman. Mary Beth is the expert legal counsel who we have been working with for some time on this project. So we're all here available at the end of the presentation for questions. And I will mention that Mary Beth is here today. We don't plan to bring her back in the future when we do the first reading of the ordinance. So hopefully if you've got questions for her, we can address those today. If not, we'll have to do that via email or teleconference or however that might become necessary. So with that, I'll jump into the presentation, and this is just an overview of what what we'd like to cover today. I'd like to provide you with an overview of our pension trusts. I don't intend to make you pension experts or hope that you will be pension experts by the end of the day, but there are some kind of key elements of the structure of the pension funds that the city has that are important, I think, to understand just some of the things that are being proposed. I do want to review the 2013 pension reform changes, especially as they relate to retiree health benefits, and talk specifically about the funding of those benefits and the impact that some of those changes had on the funding for retiree health benefits. I want to cover the objectives that we're seeking to achieve how we plan to meet those objectives, how the ordinance changes will achieve those objectives. Talk specifically about the new trust fund that I had mentioned to you, the 115 trust. I'll ask Mary Beth to review the ordinance changes, the revisions in the ordinance that'll be coming before you. And then lastly, before we finish, I want to try to bundle all this up with an explanation of why this is important and why we think it's should be moving forward. So with that, just a relatively brief overview of our current pension trusts. The city actually maintains two retirement systems or pension plans. As you can see on the slide, the first is the employees' retirement system. That system really covers all of our police and general employees. The second plan is the firefighters' pension fund that, as you I'm sure would guess, covers our firefighters, the fire employees. So those are really two very separate and distinct pension trusts that are maintained by the city. And if you look at our financial reports and so forth, you will see that those are reported and maintained on a separate basis, very separate and distinct from each other. Within each of those two pension trusts, then, there are two what I refer to as buckets of money. Each one has two buckets of money. Bucket number one is the larger of the two in each case. That is the bucket of money that is used to pay pension benefits or income replacement. When a city employee retires, dollars in that bucket are then utilized to pay pension benefits. The second, bucket number two, is a retiree health care bucket, or a retiree health care benefit. That is, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, in the Internal Revenue Code, that's referred to as a 401H account. It's really it's part of the pension trust, but it is a separate and distinct bucket of money within the pension trust. And as you can see, we've got one of those in each of our two pension plans, one in the employees' retirement system and one in the firefighters' pension fund. Talking specifically about some of the differences in the two buckets within each of those two plans. The defined benefit pension plan is funded from three sources. The employees make contributions to their pension plan. Those contributions are a fixed percentage of each employee's pay. So out of each employee's paycheck that's participating in the plan, they will have withheld from their check 5% for general employees. Our public safety employees have 10%. So that's sets the employee's contribution to their what will eventually be their pension benefits. Of course, that money is accumulated in a trust fund and is invested. Investment income is what it is. The pension board oversees the management of those investments and, of course, tries to maximize the return. For actuarial purposes, the actuary assumes that over the long term, the city pension fund will earn a 7.5% annual return. Now, that has one of the goals that the board has is to reduce that assumption so that to in effect make the plans more conservative by assuming less of those future dollars or fewer of the future dollars will come from investment returns. And because the employee contributions are fixed at a fixed percentage, investment income is assumed to be 7.5%, but if that comes up short of 7.5% over the long term, any shortfall in that or any additional funds required come from the city contribution. So the city contribution changes from year to year. It's not a fixed percentage of the payroll or of the employee's pay. It is determined really by the actuary what liabilities we're incurring each year, what liabilities are accumulating, and then from that deducting employee contributions and investment returns. And so that's why the city's employer contribution does vary from year to year. The second bucket, the retiree health care bucket, is funded from only two sources, that is from past city contributions and investment income. So there have not been employee contributions made into that retiree health care bucket. That's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind. So really, two key points that I want to make here, that being one, that all the assets in the retiree health care buckets came from city contributions originally and investment of those funds, so no employee contributions. Secondly, any shortfall in investment income over the long term must be made up by higher city contributions. And I think this is a good time to mention when the pension boards first began to tackle several years ago the concerns about the sustainability of the city's pension plan. They really that was driven primarily by the volatility that the city was seeing in the employer or the city's contribution rates. Contribution rates were growing to the point where there was concern about whether or not the city could sustain that over the long term. And so that was made their number one goal in evaluating different changes that could be made. Again, this was back in 2010, 2011, and leading up to the changes that were made in 2013. The number one goal was to reduce the volatility of the city's contributions and over the long term put the city's contributions on a path, on a declining path. So that again is I think an important thing to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this discussion. So looking at what did we actually change in terms of the retiree health benefits back in 2013, and again all these changes were adopted by the city council. Prior to them coming to the council, they were approved by a vote of our employees, so that was it was really a cooperative effort, the city working with the employees. There were other important changes made that didn't directly involve retiree health benefits. The plan itself has been closed. Any employees hired after July 1st of 2013 do not become members of the city's retirement system. They participate in the South Dakota retirement system. So that was a key changes that was made back then. Employee contribution rates were increased, and benefits themselves for those that remained in the city's plan were enhanced. But what really brings us here today is the has to do with the changes made to the retiree health benefits. And essentially what the change that was made was that retiree access to the city's health insurance plan was eliminated. So that was eliminated, effective for employees retiring after December 31st, 2013. So anyone that's retired in 2014 or since then or in the future will not have access to the city's health insurance plan. Retiree health benefits do still apply for those employees who had retired prior to January 1st of 2014, and if they're on the plan, they can stay on the plan until they become eligible for Medicare coverage. So that was the change that was made back in 2013, or approved back in 2013. The impact on the funding of those benefits then was significantly affected. Because we were talking about so many fewer employees ultimately drawing on that health insurance benefit, because the window had closed, the city's liability for future premiums was significantly reduced. So for many, many years, the city had been accumulating assets to eventually fund retiree health care benefits within that 401H account. And as a result of the liability being decreased, we've got assets there to fund benefits for far more employees. Eventually, those accumulated assets exceeded the reduced liability. So that's really what we're here today to talk about, and what do we do with those excess assets. So again, just to make sure that's clear to everyone, I want to walk through it one more time, just how we came to be in this situation. So for many years, the city had been making contributions to these 401H accounts within our two retirement systems in anticipation that potentially all city employees could eventually become eligible to participate in the city's group health insurance plan after they retired. So we've got, today we've got somewhere around 1,200 full-time employees. Back then it was a little bit less in terms of the head count, but you kind of get the picture. When access was closed, so when that window closed, the number of retirees who would eventually participate on the city's health insurance plan was drastically reduced. So if you didn't retire by the end of 2013, you forever lost your access to stay on the city's health plan after retirement. And so that number went from well, I suppose in theory, potentially an infinite number if you go out, many, many years into the future, to a very fixed number of people at the end of 2013 who had retired and were participating on the plan. And so that was really a relatively few in number. So with that new, very small and very fixed number of retirees who could ever participate in the city's health insurance plan, the city's total overall obligation to pay a portion of the health insurance premiums likewise was greatly reduced. So we had a lot fewer employees or future retirees that the city was going to be responsible for. The net result, bottom line, is that the retiree health care benefit bucket, or those two buckets, one in each of our plans, have more assets than will be required to pay the city's obligation for those retirees' health insurance premiums. The pension benefit buckets in each of our two plans will need more assets. So that's really in its simplest terms, we've got in each plan two buckets. One has more money than it needs, one doesn't have as much as it will need. So that's where we're, the ball we're carrying right now. So looking at the objectives that we're trying to achieve with this ordinance, as I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago, one of the objectives is to fully fund a 115 trust, and the 115 references the Internal Revenue Code section that creates these animals or makes them an option for the city. So the objective is to fully fund that 115 trust to pay remaining retiree health benefits, pay the city's share of those benefits. The second objective is to move the excess assets, those assets that aren't necessary to fund future benefits for retirees, for our current retirees, to close those 401H accounts and transfer those excess assets into the pension benefit bucket, so to speak. So at the end of the day, what we want to do is take the assets that are in the trust today and keep them in the trust rather than allow them to be reverted to any other purpose. Kind of a secondary objectives are to make the accounting consistent with current GAAP requirements. Some of the accounting and financial reporting language that is in the ordinance today has become a little archaic with changes that have been made with generally accepted accounting principles and some of the Government Accounting Standards Board requirements as it relates to financial reporting for pension systems. And so at this opportunity, we'd like to clean that up and bring that up to something more current as well. In addition, make language consistent with the current revenue code. So those two items really, in a lot of ways, I would put in under the heading of kind of housekeeping cleanup of the pension, Title 39 pension ordinances. The last two bullets I think are really important, of course, to our current employees and to our retirees, is that the objectives here are to preserve the promised retiree health care benefits and the promised employee pension benefits. So nothing in any of these ordinances as they're being proposed would make any changes to the retiree health care benefits or to the future pension benefits for our employees. So I know that's been a key topic of discussion since sometime last week. So how do the ordinance revisions meet those objectives? And it's really, I think, fairly intuitive, at least on the first couple points. The accounting terminology throughout the ordinance, and if you've looked at it, I know it was provided earlier and it will be again before first reading. It's quite a lengthy ordinance. It's all of Title 39 that you'll see, and it runs some 70 pages or so, but throughout that you'll see changes to the accounting terminology. It's all been updated throughout the ordinance, again, to be consistent with the current financial reporting standards that are dictated by generally accepted accounting principles. Likewise, you'll see a lot of updates to language relating to the current Internal Revenue Service Code as it relates to our pension system. The ordinance revisions, really the meat of what we're doing here, will include language that will close both of the 401H accounts. Those are the retiree healthcare buckets again. Simultaneously with closing those two accounts, we will establish a single new 115 trust, and that trust will be outside of the pension system. And at that same time, the ordinances will deposit sufficient assets from those closed 401H accounts into the 115 trust to fully fund the city's obligation to pay retirees' future health insurance premiums. The remaining assets would be deposited into the pension trusts, as I've been saying, the Employees Retirement System and the Firefighters Pension Fund. So at this point, I want to provide you, because we didn't talk about this when I first raised this for discussion, about the amount of money involved. I do want to share that with you. Combined in the two 401H accounts, and I'm using numbers from December 31st of 2015. That was the last audit report, and that was also the date of the last actuarial valuation that was done by our actuary. The total asset value at that time was $31.4 million. That's combined of the two 401H accounts. The outstanding liability as measured by the actuary was $7.5 million. So at that point in time, that would indicate there was just under $24 million of excess assets in those two 401H accounts. Those numbers will most certainly change. We'll have, once the ordinances move forward and if they're approved, the actuary will reevaluate as of December 31st of 2016. So early next year, we would learn what those updated numbers would be. Since the end of last year, of course, nearly a year's worth of premiums now have come out of there, or the city's share of those premiums have been paid out. In addition, investment returns have been flowing into that fund, so that would those two would offset one another to some degree. Again, the new actuarial valuation will be needed as of 12/31 of 16 to determine the value of those excess assets, and that will drive how much would need to be deposited within this new 115 trust and how much would be available to deposit into the two pension funds. Cover just a few important points on the new 115 trust, and this is really largely to respond to some of the questions that we heard from you folks, as well as from some of our employees. The new 115 trust, it is a trust legally created, exclusively used for retiree health insurance benefits. And as I've been saying, the intention is to have it 100% funded on day one, so the city would not be making any additional contributions, or at least that's the anticipation. The nature of the liability, as I mentioned, the number of people covered, number of retirees still participating in our group health plan is really relatively small. Currently, there are about 170 lives. That includes retirees. If they have a spouse or other dependents, that would include them as well. So you can see it's 170 essentially individuals that are currently covered under this plan. About a quarter of those are covered for dental only. So it's roughly 125 lives that are covered for health benefits. The run out on this, the life of this trust would be, in comparison to our pension system, will be relatively short because the retirees drop off when they become Medicare eligible. It's very defined length of time during which they will be drawing part of their insurance premiums out of this trust. To maybe put some numbers to that, well, I'll get to that in just a minute, but the investment approach, because it does have a relatively short life, we figure within 15 years that we'll be down to either nobody left in the plan, no other retirees participating, or it will just be a handful of 5 or so by then. Because it does have a short run out, very short life, again, in comparison to the pension plan, the investment approach will be somewhat different. The investments assumption that the actuary will use will be different than it would for our pension plan, because those assets will be invested in a much more conservative fashion. The cost assumptions used by the actuary, they do utilize 9% inflation for healthcare, so they assume The costs to provide that health insurance coverage from out of that bucket of money is going to increase at a rate of 9% inflation in the early years, and then it gradually increments down to about 4.25% by year 2025. And that's a very common method that actuaries use to cost out future health care benefits. I did want to go back to the short term that this trust will have, or short life. As I mentioned, going into 2017, we have about 170 lives that are affected by this or covered by this. In year 2020, just 3 years later, be down to 87 lives. 5 years later, it'd be down to 53. And by 2027, 10 years from now, we would be down to five individuals. That is, if everybody stays on the plan. So it does run out very, very quickly, which again, that will drive the approach taken in terms of investing those dollars in that fund. They would be invested in very safe, secure U.S. government treasuries, so we wouldn't be looking at the risk of taking investment losses and having to make them up in later years. So that's the approach with the 115 Trust. At this point, I do want to introduce Mary Beth Breitman. Mary Beth is the expert legal counsel that we've been working with. She's with the firm Ice Miller Counsel out of Indianapolis. And I've asked Mary Beth to talk a little bit about her role and her firm's role in this process, share any observations that she'd like to about our pension plans and kind of what we're up to here, as well as covering the ordinance revisions for Title 39. Mary Beth?
Welcome.
Hello. It's a great pleasure to be here with you tonight, and a couple different reasons for that. First, I had not gotten to see your lovely city before, and it is lots going on here, and it's beautiful developments going on. So thank you for allowing me to be here tonight. The other reason is I don't spend a really high percent of my time in a case which involves such a great structure as you have here. You are, with your 80% plus funding on both the pension plans and your more than 100% funding on the health side, you're in an enviable position. One of my last presentations that was similar to this was a situation where they actually were not sure how they were going to make December pension payroll with liquid assets out of the pension fund. So I mean, this is a pleasure to see the prudence and the thought and the effort that has gone into creating rational benefit structures, funding them appropriately, and managing the assets of those plans in the interest of the participants. So I just thought that was important to note, because it's not as common as one would hope or it should be, unfortunately, right now. I wanted to just spend a few moments on the legal issues, just to fill out a little bit more. What you've just heard is the description of the transactions, of, if you will, going on. The first part of the ordinance closes the 401H accounts, and then establishes, Section 2 establishes the new 115 trust. All of these trusts are creatures of the Internal Revenue Code. The 401H it's a particular account within a pension plan that's used to pay retiree medical. The 115 is a broader-based trust which can be used to pay retiree medical and certain other benefits. So you're using different, and each of the, as will come as no surprise to anyone in the room, I'm sure, each of these trusts have come with their whole complete set of rules and regulations that govern that type of trust. And so that's what we've been working with, to try to find the most appropriate vehicles and get you a process in place that will put the money that you've accumulated to fund these benefits in good vehicles to fund to not overfund the ones that you've really funded so well that they're now overfunded, to not underfund any at all at the time this transaction's done. So those two very well funded, in fact overfunded 401H accounts would be closed. Then the dollars would flow ultimately to the 115 trust to pay the remaining liability there, and then to the balance would then go to each of the pension funds. So it seems like a cumbersome process. It is a process that the IRS has prescribed to handle circumstances like this. It's not much used because of the fact there aren't that many 401H accounts that are significantly overfunded. Most of them are in the significantly underfunded category, but they have created this set of transactions that would allow you to allow a city or a state to get the money where it's most needed, where it is in fact needed. So that's the process that we've been working on with your team, and it might sound cumbersome and it may look ominous when you look at all of the ordinance changes. The ordinance changes do these two things, but then in addition, as you've also heard, they do take care of an update, and that's just a periodic event that you've done many times before, to changes in the federal law and the federal regulations. So all that's embedded in here, and the IRS has approved both plans in terms of being up to date with their requirements now, and then a simplification of some of the accounting. So with that, I will turn it back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Beth. And I'm just going to wrap it up then with a little discussion on why go through all of this. If you haven't been convinced yet, but the number one reason really is to strengthen our pension trusts. And the pension plans will be strengthened, one, because these additional assets that will go into the pension funds will provide a buffer or reserve of sorts within the pension plan to absorb poor investment returns in a year when that happens, so that, as I said very early on in the presentation, if we have years where investment returns come in below what we're assuming they will, those shortfalls have to be made up by higher contributions by the city then in the future. So these dollars would provide a buffer against that, and to help follow through on that number one goal of eliminating the volatility of city contributions in the future, as well as putting us on a trend of declining contributions for the long term. It also will provide some additional assets in the pension plan that could potentially absorb the impacts of moving to more conservative actuarial assumptions. And that's, I mentioned the investment assumption of 7.5%. Very few years ago, just a couple of years ago, that was at 7.75. The board has set a goal of getting that down to 7.25. So we're halfway to that goal now. This could make it possible to eventually get that assumption down to that 7.7 or 7.25% return goal that the board established. It will also strengthen the pension plans by protecting the excess dollars in the healthcare buckets today from being diverted to other uses in the future. And we talked about that a little bit last time, that from a purely legal standpoint, the City Council could choose to do other things with this money. But I think today is really an opportunity to make a prudent, responsible decision to utilize these dollars for the purpose for which they were set aside in the first place, and that is to fund the city's obligation to pay for retiree benefits. And so that, I think, is a key aspect of this. It will keep those assets that are currently in the pension trusts, in those trusts. One of the reasons, and Mary Beth alluded to that there are a lot of rules and regulations when we're dealing with Internal Revenue Code and trust law and so forth, that we cannot simply move. You know, at first blush, it seemed like, well, it would be a very simple thing. Let's just move the money from bucket A to bucket B and as Tom likes to say, call it a day. Well, you know, if as Fifely often says, you know, if there's a good idea out there, there's probably a law against it, and that's one of those situations where I think that's probably true. So we can't simply access that overfunding in the retiree health bucket without closing the 401H accounts. Leaving the excess assets in the retiree health buckets could mean higher pension contributions on the city's part in the years to come, again, because if there's a down year in markets, that will put upward pressure on the city's contribution and ultimately result in that. It does, these changes will maintain our plan as a qualified retirement plan or plans under the Internal Revenue Code and keep us current with all the Internal Revenue Code requirements and again, simplify the accounting for the retirement plan. So just one last reminder that this is in line with and consistent with the overall goal of the 2013 pension reforms that the boards brought forth, that the employees endorsed, and that the City Council ultimately adopted, in that this will help to reduce the volatility of the city contributions, and in the long term will help reduce city contributions. So with that, the entire team is here, so whatever questions you have, we will try to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. I have to duly note that Director Turbeck called these funds animals, and Ms. Braitman, you called them creatures. And so as someone who's not an IRS expert, I'm a little frightened by all of this, but we'll do our best to get through it. My question is, Tracy, can you talk us through that idea of what happens once essentially we're going to use this money to reduce our contribution, at least for a period of time, I think. And what happens to our ongoing budget planning when we do that? If we take this big lump and put it in there, it's going to eventually kind of come back to, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to run our budget again, right? So I guess I'm not understanding what happens to our budget overall once we start moving these contributions around a little bit.
Sure. And the easy answer is that this won't have any immediate impact on the city's contribution. So the ordinance requires that the city contribution, the employer's contribution, has to be at least the amount equal to what benefits are accruing during any given year. So rather than reducing contributions from our current levels, it's really those dollars will protect us from having our contributions spike up in the future, as I said, because either investment returns aren't what they were projected to be or forecast to be, or if we want to take a more conservative approach in making actuarial assumptions. So that's really the goal with these, is not to reduce our current level of contribution, but really to prevent them from spiking up in the future.
And I think that's
reducing that volatility.
I think that's the piece I wasn't comprehending correctly. And I think I'm kind of visualizing it as a float. It's kind of helping that remain more steady rather than to see the spikes that we might see
Exactly.
in a more dramatic market situation. So thank you. I appreciate that explanation.
Councilor Neitzer.
I do have a couple questions. The first thing I would say is, maybe I'm on the wrong track, but to help the average citizen understand this, to me, what it really seems like is when I've left an employer and I've taken a 401k, which is a creature of the IRS, and I've done a rollover to an IRA, which is another creature of the IRS. I've got all these arcane rules I have to follow, but frankly, I'm just moving money from one bucket to another.
That's pretty much it. Yeah.
More or less what we're doing here. So for employees that were hired before 2014, they stay in the old plan. I just want to make sure that we have a baseline. They stay in the old retirement plan. Is that true?
July 1 of 2013 was the cutoff date for employees. So anyone hired on July 1st of 2013 or later is participating in the state system. Anyone that had already been employed as of June 30th of 2013 stays in the city plan.
Okay. So can you help me through the contributions to the old plan? Is that something where at the end of the year you true up and you look to see if you're at 80% or whatever, and then you make one lump? Or how does the funding of that happen, the city portion?
Yep. It actually happens much sooner than that. The actuary will determine at the end of each calendar year, the actuary will look at where we are at that point in time and project out what the growth of our payroll will be, how long people will live, how long they'll stay employed with the city, how many of, they go through all that census data calculation of our group of people, and they will determine, based on our financial situation at the end of this year, and tell us how much we will have to contribute in 2018. So we will know very early in 2017 what our contribution will have to be in 2018.
And that would be baked into the budget?
Right.
That would be a line item
right,
in each department?
Yep, exactly. So we get that information before the 2018 budget is put together, and that really that works out well in terms of the timing, because we know at the time we're putting our budget together for 18 what our contribution will have to be.
Okay, and finally, so Councilor Erpenbach was going down the same track I was. I think I'm all good with this, except for kind of what she touched on. So just to put it in simple terms, let us say I have a mortgage payment of $1,000 a month, and I get a windfall of $50,000. For the next 4 years, I can take that windfall and I can pay my mortgage payment. That's taking care of a big chunk of my operating expense. I could then let my budget start to creep up and start to chew that up for 4 years, and I could get away with it. For example, the next city councilor, the city councilor for the next 3 or 4 years, if we were to do that, that budget could creep up, but then when we hit the wall, as it were, somebody's really going to be in trouble. So my only hang-up was, if you had this windfall, would it allow us to spend money that really wasn't going to last forever, and then we would have a problem? For example, would you be in the situation where you don't make any pension contributions for several years because you don't have to, and then we're in trouble, or we hand it off to another council?
Right. No, that's a good question. And as I mentioned, the ordinances as they are today and as they would be after these amendments still require the city to make an annual contribution as determined by the actuary, that's calculated to be the amount of money that's needed to pay the benefits that are accruing because our employees have worked another year. So yeah, the intention is not, and the result would not be, to reduce our operating budget or take a contribution holiday, kind of as you're describing. These dollars would be, again, used to manage, to buffer lower investment returns if we don't hit that 7.5% return, or, as I said, the boards are managing those investment assumptions, and they've laid out a set of goals that move both of the systems in a more conservative direction, and one of those key ones is that investment return assumption. They want to get that down to 7.25%. And when you do that, that assumes you will in the future have less money flowing into the funds from investments. And so those dollars have to be made up from somewhere. Well, if they can be made up by utilizing some of this buffer, this reserve, that would be an appropriate way to accomplish that, again, without spiking city contributions.
Thank you. That was my major concern, and that's good to have that alleviated.
Thank you.
Councilor Erikson.
Thank you. Full disclosure, I don't think any of us are pension experts, so thank you for educating us on a pretty difficult topic. So my question is, there's an excess of about $24 million then. So does that go into the reserves? Does it have to stay in pension bucket for a rainy day in case we don't meet the contributions? Or where does that money live?
Right. It would go into the pension funds and be established as a reserve, and the pension boards would be responsible to manage that. If investment returns are 0 instead of 7.5%, then that would be a reserve that they could use as a buffer to prevent the city's contribution then the next year from spiking up. Again, they could also utilize that as a one-time release of reserve funds and put it into the general pension funds if they wanted to reduce the assumption of future investment returns below the 7.5% that it is today.
One more if I can, because I'm Thank you. That helps me clear that up. So they put it in a pension reserve fund. If that money wants to move out of that particular bucket, as you called it, would that take council action, or could that be done based on that board feeling that it's appropriate move to meet that 0%? Or, I mean, how does that work as far as expending those pension buckets?
Sure. Once it's in the pension trust, it's there, and it has to stay there regardless. I don't, Mary Beth could correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure the city council could legally even take it out of there. Certainly the pension boards couldn't take it out and use it for some other purpose.
Yeah.
But it is, the city has for many years relied on those pension boards to manage the funds that are within those pension trusts, and I think they've done a phenomenal job, and that would be up to them really to make some decisions about how much of those reserve dollars to utilize or apply toward making different actuarial assumptions.
Thank you for clarifying.
Councilor Seeley.
Tracy, how much a year are we taking out of the general fund and putting into the pension fund?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I guess I can't tell you the general fund share of it, but the total city contribution last year, I think, was about 15.8 million. That would be general fund, all of our enterprise funds, any funds that have employees participating.
Oh, and is that the number that you've consistently seen go into the pension fund, about 15 million?
Well, it has over the years been rather volatile, and that's been one of the problems that the pension reforms were intended to address. And so yeah, it's not necessarily real stable.
Would it ever be like 11 million? I mean, does it fluctuate by 5 million?
Yeah, I could certainly get you the history on that.
So I guess my concern is if we move the 401 excess of 20, and you're proposing we take the 24 million and put it into the pension fund, is that correct?
First of all, the number we don't know yet. That will be determined by the actuary after the end of this calendar year. The actuary will first of all tell us what the value of our assets is and how much of that is needed to fully fund the city's obligation to pay retiree health insurance premiums. And the difference between those two numbers then would be the excess.
But I mean, you kind of threw out the 24 million extra now, right? You said it was.
That's just to give you a general idea of the magnitude.
But your plan would be to take. You said 31.4 million. It needed 7 million. The 24. So whatever they decide is not needed, that amount, let's say it's 20 million, is going to go into the new pension fund, right?
Into the existing pension funds.
Okay, bucket one. And then my question is, are we going to operate as a city as if that money wasn't there and continue to take the money out of the general fund to fund this? We would just be keeping that like in a CD? Or are we going to be actually tapping into that money to help pay the commitments for the pension fund, for the pensioners?
The assets can only be, any assets that are in the pension fund can only be used to benefit retirees.
I understand, but
there's no getting around that. But the city will not be, as I mentioned a minute ago, will not be utilizing that as an opportunity to reduce the amount that's coming out of the general fund. What we do want to prevent, though, is the amount coming from the general fund and all of our other city budgets from spiking, from increasing. We want to get that on a track of declining, and it will naturally over time decline because we've got a closed plan. We aren't adding new participants on the city's pension system anymore. So eventually we will reach a point where that line will start going down. But in the meantime, we want to protect the city and the city's budgets from increasing city contribution. But
if we were to vote not to do this move and just to leave it where it is, and even though it's overfunded, that account is never going to grow anymore from contributions, right? The 401H, that's only going to grow from the market growing, correct?
Right.
Okay, so if we were to leave that money in there, we would still be able to operate just fine from the general fund funding the pension plan, right? We're not looking at, we're going to have some kind of a squeeze moving forward.
There are a couple things about that, two risks that we would be taking that we don't have to take if you do adopt these changes. One, the risk that lost my train of thought now. The biggest thing is that you will be missing that opportunity to make a prudent, responsible decision to prevent those excess assets from ever being used for something other than retiree benefits. If you choose to leave them in there, so to speak, in those 401h accounts, in 15 years when the last participant is no longer participating, those excess assets will remain there and will revert just as they are today. If you close it, revert back to the city. It will be up to the city council then to make a decision at that time. Folks, none of you folks will be here anymore, very likely. And those folks will decide whether or not that money should stay in the pension plan or whether or not it should be used to be spent on something else. These are dollars that the city contributed to the plan to be set aside to pay future retiree benefits. And that's really what this action would do, to lock them into a trust fund so that they could never be used for anything other than that. You can choose to kick the can down the road, which is maybe a crude way of describing what you're saying. Just do nothing, leave the assets there, let the 401h accounts run out till nobody's participating, and let somebody else decide how to utilize that money. You folks are here today. It's the changes, the pension reforms that have been made are still pretty fresh in everyone's mind. You understand that that was really part of the deal. The pension benefits were enhanced at the time access was closed, and so there's really I think an aspect to this where we're just fulfilling the action that was started several years ago.
I guess if I could just add something to that, Counselor, that I'm looking at this as we've got, let's just say your $20 million that's sitting there. You can sit there and do nothing, or we can take that $20 million from the health part of it, not the regular pension plan, but the health part of it, move it over to the pension plan part of it that gives a monthly benefit, and go from 82% of funding. We can immediately go then to 88 or 89% fully funding. And so we've done a better job of funding the amount of money that is in the pension plan, which we need to continue and will always have to continue to contribute.
But my concern is if we didn't move this, would we still be able to do that? Are we saying that we needed to take this?
We would have to put in the $15 million or $20 million somehow to make that happen. Yes.
Yeah, I don't expect that to change appreciably. The other risk I lost my train of thought on. If we do nothing and keep the assets in the existing 401h account, the additional risk is exactly what we're trying to protect ourselves against, that if we have poor investment returns, we can't utilize those dollars to offset that if they remain in the 401h account.
But we could still take this action later, couldn't we? I mean, this isn't like a time-sensitive thing for right now. Let's say in 2 years the council decided to do this. They could still do it.
Yeah, I don't see any reason to wait.
But they
frankly,
could.
Well, certainly they could, yes. I guess there's never a bad time to make a good, prudent, responsible decision.
Councilor Starr?
Yes, absolutely. Tracy, if I'm understanding you correctly, one of the other advantages, I guess, that I see in this, if we did move ahead, if we freed up, we should pick a number that we're roundly using, whether it's 20 or 24, I guess it doesn't matter. By moving it to the pension fund, we're going to invest that money more aggressively than if we left it in the healthcare bucket. Is that one place
I think that's probably a fair statement, yes. The pension, the dollars that are invested today in the pension plan are invested to generate a return of about 7.5%. The assets that would be in the healthcare bucket, so to speak, because it's a very short run out, would be invested much more conservatively.
Closer to that, what we get in our passbook savings
Well,
accounts or
hopefully
CD
a little
rates
better
at
than
this
that.
point. I mean, this is one place, I guess that's an advantage to it. Just because I'm following Councilor Staley's train of thought that it's such a short run in the big picture of pension plans, 10 to 12 years or 15 of moving it out with such a small group of people. Part of me says that it's prudent to let that in that short amount of time run out and move it and realize the savings when we know that we've met the obligation to these pensioners. And that's where I'm balancing my thought process in that. So more of a disclosure than a thing. So in such a short amount of time, and as those people drop off, it may, I'm balancing those two things. And I think that's part of what the pension board did. That's what our actuary does for us. And that's what you're asking us to make that final decision on. One other place, if it's okay, Mr. Chairman. I saw in the notes or in your presentation, you were talking about that the city council is the trustee then for the new trust.
Right.
So are the council is the lone trustees of that account, or is there a separate board that we set up for that, or do we manage that through council procedure? Or proceedings, I guess is the word I was looking for.
Well, it's really, for the most part, on autopilot. I mean, the eligibility rules are established by ordinance in terms of who participates in the plan, so those things will not change. The one key decision that's made from a trustee standpoint is how those funds would be invested, and the council already has a policy on how city dollars are invested. Just like our general, our normal cash flow investments are invested in that same very conservative fashion that I described for this trust. So I don't know, Mary Beth, is there anything else to add to that?
Thank you.
One thing I might mention too, in terms of your first comments about the run out, and well, yeah, in the life of pensions, 15 years isn't maybe a long time, but keep in mind that most of that obligation is going to be fulfilled in the first 5 years. So most of the dollars that are going to flow out for premiums are going to flow out in the very first few years, first 4 or 5 years. But then for the last 10 or 11 years, there are going to be very few participants, but a lot of excess assets sitting there and not producing as they potentially could be. So I think the prudent, again, I mean, it's clear. The prudent thing to do is to take this action now, make the decision to commit to that. Again, part of the concern is that in 15 years, no one will necessarily remember that the city did enhance pension benefits in 2013, essentially in compensation for retirees giving up access to retiree health insurance. So that's an obligation that the pension fund has taken on that this would certainly help to offset.
Councilor Erikson, did you have something? No, okay, Councilor.
I-
Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. Let's go over here first. Councilor Kiley.
Thank you. I'm going to change directions here just a little bit, but I think it gets to the same point. Going back to the health bucket and the current 401H, we have an abundance of dollars in that bucket now, not due to an overestimation of what we needed in that bucket, but that is a result of the fact that we now have a finite group of individuals that we need to cover with their health care needs, where before the contributions were going in as if that plan was never going to end and we were going to have hundreds, really 1,000 more individuals participating in that health care bucket, correct?
Spot on.
Okay, so it's not due to an overestimate. And the reason I asked that is because in talking with some of our retirees, there was concern over, well, if we had overestimated, and now we know there wasn't an overestimation, but what if if we underestimate, if the actuaries actually underestimate the amount that's needed to take care of that finite group until they reach retirement age, until they reach 65 and go on to Medicare? What assurances do they have that that's not going to happen?
The best Probably the best answer is that the dollars that are put in there are going to be invested very, very conservatively. So there's minimal risk, and I think investment people will refer to that as invested at a risk-free rate. I don't necessarily think there's ever such a thing that's risk-free, but very, very safe investment. So the risk of investment loss is absolutely minimized. The risk that health costs will inflate at a faster rate than what is assumed certainly is a possibility, but I can say that the actuarial assumption of 9% compounded inflation on healthcare costs is significantly higher than what the city has experienced in its group health plan over the years, significantly higher. So there again, I think there's quite a conservative approach and assumption made in terms of how those costs will escalate. They are minimized by the fact that those people roll off of that plan fairly quickly. So it's not a very long period of time, and we're down to less than 100 people, or down to 50 people left on the plan. So the risk is very, very minimal. If everything works against us, and ultimately at the end of the day, 15 years from now, there's not enough money to pay that last person's dental premium, the city will have to make that up. That's an obligation that the city will have. We do self-insure our employee group health plan. That is a well-funded plan as well, very prudently managed, and that fund, in essence, would have to absorb any last number of people that would be on the plan if all the assets had run out.
Okay, so that last part is what I really wanted to hear, and I think our retirees really wanted to hear as well, too.
Yeah, the cities can't escape that obligation.
If there was a need, the city still has the obligation to make sure that they have their coverage. Okay, and thank you for, I'm going to, we'll come back to this later, but thank you for actually removing this item from the evening agenda to provide you and your team and Bill and his team the opportunity to communicate with current employees as well as our retirees just how this process is working, because there was a great deal of concern over some misinformation that came out. So I do appreciate the fact that you are stepping back and taking the time to really get that information out and educate the individuals that really want to hear and need to hear this information.
Yeah, thank you.
And so I'll ask Bill at a later time after other questions just what that process will be.
I should point out, and of course our HR department has done a good job and has communicated and had intended all along to communicate with our retirees, with our employees about these changes. In fact, it was the communication went out the day after the retirement boards voted to recommend approval. So there wasn't a real time lag in there, just the timing of when some of this became news raised some concerns. Along that line, we have set up some times later this week to invite employees and retirees in. If they still have questions, remaining questions, we'll make time available to answer those questions. Tom and Angie have committed to sitting down with anybody that's got questions or concerns and talking that through. So,
okay, since we're discussing that process now at this point, then rather than later, has there been plans established for communicating with individuals who maybe have left town, moved south for the winter, and so forth?
I guess I can't answer that.
Thank you, Director O'Toole.
Bill O'Toole, Director of Human Resources. We will be holding on-site meetings for retirees and employees to get those questions answered. We will have utilized the written communication format for those individuals, and they're certainly willing to reach out to us via the telephone, via email, with any specific questions. So that would be my answer, Councilor.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Neitzer.
I do have one more, but something that was a big light bulb moment for me was when Director Cherbak talked about the risk of doing nothing. Perhaps, I hate to rank, but perhaps one of the most solemn and serious commitments is keeping our commitments to the retirees. We've seen, when you see the heartbreak if somebody loses their pension, and as long as you're okay with everything else, it really hit home for me that this is our chance to lock that money down and make sure it's not used for something, frankly, silly later. And that really did hit home. My last question is what is the target for the, is it 100% funded? What's our number that we're looking for in the pension that we're going to beef up, as it were?
Oh, within the pension plan?
Yes.
Yes, the goal is to get to 100% funded.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilor Selbert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the presentation. It's really good to get a lot of these questions cleared up that we've had over the last week. I just want to confirm, I think I've seen it in print, I think Councilor Starr asked the question too, but it had been suggested that the council's oversight function of these funds would cease if these funds were transferred, but that is most definitely not the case if it goes to this different fund, correct?
Nothing will change in regard to the pension plan itself, the pension trust assets. The assets in the 115 will be more directly, the oversight responsibility will more directly rest with the city council than it does today.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, seeing no other questions, don't move. I have a few. 100%, let's start with there. You were smiling when 100% came up, and that is that really the goal of our pension plan, to be at 100% funded 100% of the time, or is there a real need to be within 5 points or 10 points of 100%, knowing that we can always make up a difference if something terrible happened?
The goal of any pension plan is to get to 100% funded. Certainly, the standard, if you're above 80% funded, you're considered a well-funded plan. As of the end of 2015, and again, we've got a situation where we've got overfunding in one part of our plan and underfunding in another. But if you blend all those together and look at them holistically, our city employees' retirement system at the end of 15 was 89% funded. If you look at just the pension bucket, it was about 84%. The firefighters, again, on a blended, looking at considering the overfunding in the healthcare portion, it was 85, a little over 85% funded. I believe without the healthcare, it was at 82. So both of our plans are very well funded by any, and Mary Beth alluded to that there are a lot of plans around the country that would love to be in our funding status, but there's always that goal out there to continually increase that funded status and eventually get to 100%. I mean, that's the goal, and that's the plan the board has laid out for the future.
How much additional monies would have to be put in over the next 10 or 20 years to bring us to 100% funding, if we include this $24 million approximately that we're going to dump in now?
Right. The plan that the board has laid out and the plan that the actuary bases her contribution calculations on, and Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the goal most recently was in 22 years, based on the contributions that we've been making, that we're projecting to make and budgeting to make in the future, would get us to 100%. But that target is always changing because, you know, people come and go, and participants, of course, we're not adding any participants now, but people may work longer than the actuary had assumed, or not as long. Investment returns go up and down, and so that moves the target a little bit. A key part of an actuarial calculation is mortality tables. I mean, they look at how long people live after retirement, and those can have a significant impact on the goal that we're trying to get 100% funded. Is that right, Tom? 22 years?
It's a great goal, because as you know, that was my first question to you when this information came out, is how much closer will this put us to 100%? I'm a believer that we need to be at 100%, and we shouldn't be looking at anything else as other than that as a goal. And if we can do it in the next 20 or 22 years, that'll be great. That'll be great. Okay, thank you very much for a very, very good session. I think you answered a lot of questions, and it should put a lot of apprehension to rest for our retirees and for the council. So
Thank you, and we will plan to resubmit that for first reading then a week from tonight.
Okay.
Okay?
Super.
Thank you all.
Mr. David.
Good afternoon, Jim David, Council's Operation Manager. I won't be too long, but in your meeting packet, you'll find some information, actually your provisional legislative priorities that you approved in July. These priorities guided the Municipal League during their legislative discussion. And then last month, the Council's Legislative Ad Hoc Committee, which includes Councilors Erikson, Selberg, Rolfing, and Staley, did agree to continue with these priorities as in their current form. Last week, the committee, as was referenced earlier, had discussed these priorities with Sioux Falls area legislators, and none of them that were present expressed any concerns with the priorities as they are currently laid out. If we look at the priorities in detail, the first one, which has been on this list for probably more than 5 years, really speaks to local control and the flexibility for elected officials to address the needs locally. The second priority supports reforming the legal publication statute to allow alternative options for local government, or for municipalities. In this case, I think it's around between 60 and 70,000 that the city of Sioux Falls spends on legal publications each year. Number 3 protects the municipal government's limited funding sources, and such as sales tax and property taxes. The next item supports what's commonly referred to as workforce housing or affordable housing in South Dakota, and number 5 supports legislation allowing counties to tax alcohol. Basically, it's based on the city's ability to tax entertainment, but this is strictly alcohol. Number 6 is a general statement supporting cooperative activities between the counties and cities, and number 7 supports greater local control and flexibility for counties when it comes to budgeting. If they're flush in one bucket, they can move it over to a bucket that is not as flush with revenue. Number 8 is the newest item that was added just this year. In 2012, the legislature increased the surcharge, the 911 surcharge from 75 cents to $1.25. This was the first increase since 1989. In 2018, this is scheduled to be scaled back by 25 cents. And in communications with Metro Communications, it will impact their budget by about $200,000 in mid-2018. As I stated earlier, these priorities will be in front of you next week as a resolution. Once approved, they will be sent to the South Dakota Legislative, Sioux Falls area legislators, and also to the Municipal League. Happy to answer your questions.
I do not have a question, but just want to emphasize once again number 8 there regarding supporting or extending or repealing the sunset of the 911 surcharge. That is just extremely important that we get that done to maintain our 911 services as we have them today. So I wish the group best of luck in doing that, because we do not want to see a reduction from the current funding level.
I should point out that each of these priorities are on the Municipal League's platform, or their statements of policy, including that one item. Councilor.
Councilor Rolfing has left the room, so that leaves me in charge. Any other questions at this point in time? Seeing none, then we'll have a 15-minute adjournment. Well, we'll take 15 minutes actually between the meetings. So at approximately 6 o'clock, we'll get started with our fiscal committee meeting. So this meeting is adjourned.